Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion on the finance domain for the transatlantic response to China's presence in the Baltic Sea region. My name is Chris Cutrone, and I will be today's moderator for this panel. Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm currently a candidate for a Master of International Affairs at the George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Prior to that, I've spent 20 years as a communications and public affairs professional in the United States, primarily working for elected officials and government agencies. And I've been lucky to spend the last few weeks in Riga with Olivs and Otto. So on to our panel of experts. Let's dive in because we're running a little bit behind time. Right beside me I have Dr. Søren Dosenrode. He's head of the Regional and International Studies at Aalborg University in Denmark and founder of the Aalborg Center for European Studies, where he holds the position of research director. We also have with us today Dr. Aleksandra Kuczyńska Zonik. She's head of the Department of the Baltics at the Institute of Central Europe and is also a research assistant at the John Paul II Catholic University in Lublin, Poland. And also back with us is Dr. Groenendijk, a professor of public policy, organization, and innovation at Adlon University in Norway. And we also have Mr. Linas Skirius joining us again, a co-founder of the Civic Resilience Initiative and a former advisor to a minister of parliament in Lithuania. And he is currently working in the field of digital security, disinformation, and media literacy. So just to dive right into it, I'm going to start today by having each of the panelists do a short presentation for about 3 minutes on the economic and financial aspects of their works that we are unveiling, and then we'll be following up with some questions from me and then a Q&A from the audience. The panelists will also have an opportunity to make some closing remarks if we have some time. So first, I'd like to start with Dr. Dosenrode.
Okay. Thank you very much. Chris, you just stole 2 minutes of my time. Anyway, when China's economy started growing under Deng Xiaoping, he was opening China. Denmark wanted to help promote democracy, rule of law, and of course especially get a fair share of the trade and investments. China was seen as a country of plenty, and well, we kind of overlooked when China started copying patents, industrial espionage and so forth. It was overlooked. You can call it naivety or you can call it greed. Today, Denmark follows the course of the EU and tries to balance between remembering to criticize China when they are breaching human rights and this kind of things, while on the other hand, trying to keep trade going. I mean, it's a typical small state dilemma. Denmark tries to solve this by following American advice or pressure when it comes, and otherwise we let the European Union do the normative politics towards China. That makes it easier for our economy. You should know that Denmark's largest trade partner is the EU. That goes for finances too, full stop. Then comes the US, followed by China. One should also remember that when it comes to trade, Danish trade is 3 times larger than trade with China. And with China, Denmark has a balanced volume. So we don't have a surplus, but we don't have a deficit either, but some other states have. When it comes to Chinese firms, often state-controlled, when they invest in Denmark, not surprisingly, they invest in industries, they invest in know-how supporting the Made in China strategy, which you undoubtedly know. That should enable China to lead and define international technology standards. That's one of their points there. And that concretely includes investments in advanced information technology, robotics, sustainable energy, and aviation technology. Also, investments in design and fashion is on their list. You will remember that France, Germany, and Italy proposed that the EU member states should be able to screen foreign direct investments from states like China, when states-owned and financed firms might get involved and might invest in European firms. That means that they are spoiling the competition. Denmark in 2017 were strictly against it. We are open market, open everything. Then things happened, and as we just heard in the keynote, in 2019, even Denmark started saying that screening of foreign direct investments may be a good idea, and now we're wholehearted for it. Nevertheless, Chinese investments are still popular at the business level in Denmark because, as a Danish entrepreneur said, they are so much more willing to take a risk, where more traditional investors are more conservative. So it's still easy to come with a bag of money, Chinese money, and buy in Denmark. Summing up, Denmark is a small open economy. It needs help regarding military threats as well as economic threats. And Denmark is a full-blown Atlanticist country, pro-NATO, etc. regarding security. When it comes to economy, it's much more pro-EU, especially after the negotiations of the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, was stopped in 2019. As a typical small state, Denmark does not want to make choices between great partners, but over the last 2 years we have made these choices and we have opted for the US, I would say luckily. Thank you. Is it you, Aleksandra?
Thank you very much. I've got a very short time for my presentation, so my overview will only focus such issue concerning perception of China toward Poland, and I touched those issues, but you can also find deep analysis in the publication. So first of all, I would like to say that I'm a political scientist, so my presentation will focus more on security issue, geopolitics rather than economy. And first of all, I would like to maintain that I would like to underline that Poland is the biggest market in Central Europe, but it doesn't mean that it is very important for Chinese investment. It means that Chinese investors don't treat Poland as the very important market. It is rather recognized as a part of Central Europe, part of bigger region, 16+1 initiative, or the eastern part of European Union. It means that so far the scale of investment, Chinese investment, wasn't so very big. Because from the perspective of China, the main aim was to reach Western European markets such as Germany. So even Poland has got relatively big potential, it doesn't mean that it is very attractive for Chinese investment. The second point is that Polish government treats China with relatively low level of trust. It means that from the perspective of Poland, Chinese investments are not. There is a lack of transparency. They are corrupted, and that's why Poland is not so open for Chinese investors. And another factor which influenced the trade cooperation between Poland and China is obviously it's United States. Poland is for Poland, United States are treated as a main priority, not only in economic sense, but from the perspective of security. That's why Poland will follow United States approach towards China. And it means that in the context of American-Chinese rivalry, Poland will reject Chinese investments, such as, for example, 5G technology. Poland is more and more concerned about Chinese investment, especially it is also connected with EU regulations, EU norms toward China, because in several there are several issues which limit cooperation, limit possibility of Chinese investment in Poland. And finally, it is Russia, which also influence. I mean, not Russia itself, but a potential of such kind of cooperation between China and Russia. I mean, from Polish perspective, Russia is the main threat for security, from the perspective of security. And if Poland recognizes China as some kind of supporter of Russia, or some kind of cooperation will be observed in such field, China will also will be treated as a threat from Polish perspective, and it means that Poland will be more cautious about Chinese investment. But overall, we have to also remember that Poland is a part of 16+1 initiative, and it is quite willing and looking for Chinese investment. So it means that it is not very, very critical towards China, but security issues are more and more important now.
Yeah, thank you. Starting first with the trade relations, I think the situation for Norway and China is very similar to Denmark and China. Norway is also a small economy. That means that a large economic power like China ends up in the top list of trade partners. China is the fourth trade partner of Norway currently. We do have a trade deficit with China. And if you look at the actual trade, what is involved, it's basically from the Norwegian side, oil, machines and salmon. That is what we export to China. And we get a lot of different stuff back. Hard to say that it is a specific category. I looked in the report mainly at FDI, and I looked at inbound FDI, so Chinese investment in the Norwegian economy. I didn't look at outbound investment, which actually is also quite interesting, also in light of what the previous speaker said about, for instance, the involvement of government-led funds, like in the Norwegian case, the oljefonde, in investing in Chinese companies. So I looked at inbound FDI. In the paper I give a lot of tables, which of course I cannot repeat here. The picture that emerges from that is that in terms of inward FDI in Norway, the countries around Norway, Sweden, Denmark, but also in the larger Nordic Baltic region are the main investors, followed by other EU countries, followed by the US, followed by the UK, and then for a long time there's nothing, and then there is China. So it's not really in size a very big issue. The estimate currently is that there are approximately 93 companies in Norway that are owned by Chinese parties for more than 50%. Well, is that a lot? Is that not so much? I don't know. All in all, we're talking about 9,000 people working in that kind of, let's say, China-controlled companies. What I also list in the paper are a lot of cases that have gained attention, especially in the Norwegian press. Examples of Chinese companies taking over or taking large shares in Norwegian companies. What we can see there is that this is something that has been going on for decades already, but there's a clear peak in 2016, 2017, a bit at the end of that period that I mentioned in the earlier panel when things started to get normal again between China and Norway. This is about energy mainly, gas, oil, offshore stuff. It's about transport and about chemicals. The thing here is that even though it is indeed open source intelligence, as was mentioned earlier, we do not have the full picture. A lot of the stuff that I presented in the paper is anecdotal, because it's very hard to get a complete picture of actual Chinese involvement in terms of investment. There are a lot of smaller transactions that do not get noticed. There are also a lot of investments that follow a trail of investment, and then it's difficult to sort of find the ultimate investor. Just to give you an example of one recent acquisition made by China, the acquisition of a 13% share in Norwegian Air, which was also something that was discussed quite a lot. Norwegian Air was at the brink of going bankrupt, and it was sort of saved by the Chinese. Well, in that case, the share was taken by BOC Aviation, which is controlled by Sky Splendor Limited, controlled by the Bank of China Group Investment Limited, controlled by the Bank of China Limited, which is controlled by Central Yuan Investment Limited, controlled by China Investment Corporation, which is owned by the People's Republic of China and thus governed by the CCP. So that shows that in the case of Chinese investment in other countries, we very often have this long trail of investment, making it very hard to sort of trace back what actually has happened. And that, of course, is then linked to the final subject that I touched upon in the paper, the issue of screening. It would be very interesting to know what goes on. If you know that there is Chinese investment, and if you consider that a security risk, then you can block it. But I think in a lot of countries right now, we do not have sufficient screening mechanisms. There's a lot of things going on there. We have the EU mechanism, which is mainly about sharing information. It's not a common screening mechanism. Also in the Nordic, Baltic region, we can see that a lot of things have been changing recently over the last 2 or 3 years. But because of this chain-like pattern of investment, I think it's very important that we have much more coordination and much more of a common approach when it comes to investment screening.
I'm going to set the timer again in order not to be too long. Yeah, so I represent the country which is the smallest out of, at least out of the panelists that are sitting here. But I think my country looks the hardest not to crack for the China's, especially when you're taking into consideration the recent events. So in the past couple of years, the ongoing Chinese-Lithuanian diplomatic conflict has already demonstrated how China might use its economic leverage to lead country into submission. It is no surprise that Lithuania caused great outrage in China in November 2021 when it allowed to Taiwan to open new representative office in Vilnius. First of all, PRC's outrage was not only because it opened an office, but instead of calling it Taipei representative office, as other countries do, Vilnius officially named the Taiwanese representative office in Vilnius. Secondly, it's the first time in 18 years that European country opened a new Taiwan Representative Office. And yeah, I can mention like a couple of more things that frustrated China a lot. Firstly, Lithuania was the first one to leave in 2021 the 17+1 initiative, which was led by, I guess, Estonia and Latvia just weeks ago, right? And the second thing that Lithuanian parliament prohibited Chinese companies from developing 5G technology networks in Lithuania under the national law. So all these things together made China really frustrated, and because of that, Beijing decided to make Lithuania as an example how China could punish another country if it did not respect Chinese interests. So that's a short brief of what's happened, and I just want to mention now a couple of points what followed because of this outrage in China. So in December 2021, Lithuanian exports to China were almost completely blocked. These unofficial trade sanctions, and when I'm saying unofficial, I mean that China never officially stated any act of official decision. So it's basically what happened that China removed Lithuania as a name from their customs registers. So basically Lithuania became as another non-existing country like Isengard or other country from Lord of the Rings. So basically that's what exactly happened. Actually, those sanctions had eventually little impact on Lithuanians' economy, as exports to China was less than 1% of the total exports. However, unexpected thing happened that was probably even the people of so-called value-based diplomacy did not expect that China will punish other European countries which has relations to Lithuania. And I'll explain a little bit what I'm talking about. So China started to block the imports of other components made in EU, which has in their, for example, in their products, Lithuanian companies. So this followed great outrage, not only from the Chinese perspective, but I mean also Lithuanian authorities and the government had to deal with enormous pressure from the private institutions, from the private sectors, Lithuanian and the foreign, because it also harmed a lot of German automotive industry, which has a pretty decent presence in Lithuania. Even though Lithuanian government received a lot of pressure to de-escalate this diplomatic dispute. However, 8 months passed, but the situation remains the same. Lithuania refuses to withdraw from its value-based diplomatic stand, and the name of the Taiwanese representative office in Vilnius stays. Moreover, according to the open source information that I found, Ministry of Economic and Innovation is planning to open a trade representative office in Taipei. So I see that I'm already out of time, so I'm gonna stop right here, and maybe we'll move to the discussion part, right?
Yeah, thank you. So first I want to start with some follow-ups and talk a little bit about both Norway and Denmark. Two Nordic nations, both in NATO, yet only one in the EU, and both have sought a positive trading relationship with China, but are also beginning to understand the position more readily, similar to the US, let's say, that Chinese foreign direct investment could be an increasing security risk. Right now, as what you were saying here, Dr. Dosenrode, that the business communities seem to think that the opportunities outweigh the risks, and yet the assessments from the governments are increasing the alarms. FDI screening regimes have gone up and are going up in the EU in general. So my question to both the Norwegian and the Danish representatives here is, how much longer can the business communities in these nations continue this ambivalent attitude towards China? And are Denmark and Norway willing to forego certain trading opportunities in the future? And does this also eventually move the EU in its own small way towards some more singularity with the United States? So do we see long-term a more common position between the EU and the United States from your perspectives?
Should I start out? Yeah. Okay, good. If you had asked me just 7 months ago, I would say no, the Danish business community will not in any way react to ethic questions and this kind of stuff. But what we have seen in the Ukraine crisis is that the larger Danish firms who did not break off their ties with Russia have been punished by lower sales and public bashing. There's the shoe company Echo, you may know it. They used to be delivering shoes to the court, and they have a special, I don't know what it's called, by appointment to Her Majesty's Court, you know that. It has been taken away from them. And this kind of things, and I think that as the awareness of what's happening in China is growing, that might be the case too. Our former Prime Minister, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who is a liberal and who very much promoted Danish trade with China, said recently that he had really sincerely believed that more trade with China would bring rule of law, democracy, and this, not from one day to the other, but over time. Now he had seen that he had been naive. And he also said that sometimes one must say that values can be more important than profit. So yes, I think that first of all, I think there might be a chance that the EU will start walking more and more in the same pace, same direction. And it's a bit hard to say with certainty, but I think it goes in the same direction as the US. Nico?
No, you're right to point out that Norway is not part of the European Union. Of course, it's part of the internal market, but not part of the common trade policy. That means that Norway can have trade agreements with every other country it likes. It's not bound by any EU decision making. What you can see is that there has been a bit of a stalemate in the developments regarding a trade agreement between Norway and China. Before the 2010 thing happened with the Nobel Prize, they were very close to a new trade agreement, but now that has not been put in place, even though we have had this normalization of relationship. And I think that's probably because nowadays trade agreements are much more comprehensive than we used to have in the old days. In the old days it was just about trade of goods, but now it is more what we call deep trade agreements involving also investment issues, intellectual property issues, issues about judicial competence. So it's increasingly hard to draw up trade agreements. But still trade goes on, like it has been doing for decades. I think generally the trade issue is not so much of an issue in the sense that I think, let's say, using trade as a mechanism to force the other side to do something else is not that efficient. I think it's much more efficient to focus on investment and finance issues. That's much more important. And in that sense, you can see, I think, similar movement as in Denmark, that generally the awareness of the importance of this issue has been growing. Your question was directed specifically at the standpoint of business communities. Well, that's always a bit hard, I think, because if you are looking at business communities, there is an asymmetry. You say, okay, the opportunities outweigh the risks. That's true, but the opportunities are also private. private gains for businesses. The risks are collective security risks. So business communities probably are not the best party to listen to in this regard.
Thank you for both of that. So I'd like to move on to Poland. You discussed real quick about the U.S. relationship with Poland in the security matters and how this might dictate Poland's view of Chinese investment. Poland has obviously sought a positive relationship with China. They've signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative, but also they've been a little bit more in line with U.S. positions on Huawei and taken steps to more aggressively screen FDI. So how much of this is really, how much of Poland's decision-making about China is really about serious security concerns with China, and how much of it is more as a desire to remain in alignment with the U.S. On other political and security matters? And do you think U.S. influence over Poland and congruity on these issues of Chinese investment will contribute to putting the EU more in line with the U.S. long-term on matters of investment with China?
Yeah, it is what I said before. For Polish perspective, security issues are the top of priority. So, in context of relation between Poland and China, Poland will follow a United States approach. A United States approach against China, and even Poland realized that there are some benefits from cooperation with China. I mean, Belt and Road Initiative, but strictly in the context of Russian invasion against Ukraine. United States is very important guarantee of Poland's stability and sovereignty. And what I started to say, I mentioned Belt and Road Initiative and this big infrastructure project, which is from the Polish perspective recognized as a quite beneficial. But once more, if Poland will follow United States and will be more and more concerned about this investment, about this initiative. So we can, the main probable is that Poland will limit such Chinese investment in Poland as well. And taking back to 16+1 initiative, I said that so far Poland has been quite engaged in this initiative, looking for benefits, looking for investment. But everybody knows that it is not a very effective initiative. But on the other hand, I doubt that Poland will follow Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in this matter. I mean, Poland is not so critical against China to leave this initiative. It's rather be in the part without doing nothing. I mean, if you follow Polish foreign policy toward Central Europe, you can also recognize that Poland focuses on free initiative now. So I would say that this free sea initiative will be more important for Poland, or even such issue like China will also be a part of discussion on the free initiative forum, but not very active discussion on 16+1 initiative. But once more, I don't believe that Poland will leave this initiative in a short time.
Okay, thank you for that. So let's go back to Lithuania. And as Mr. Skirius was saying, describing the situation that Lithuania is in, locked in a standoff a bit with China. And this is continuing to be a changing situation. New developments are happening almost weekly in some ways. I have a couple questions here. I'd like to start, do we have any idea on how Lithuania has weathered these unofficial sanctions from China, and how has it shown some resilience, or has it even received some support from its EU and US partners?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I mentioned before, Lithuanian export doesn't, it's like Lithuanian export to China is less than 1%. But quite recently, I got from Lithuanian National Bank issued estimations of economic impact on Lithuania's economy resulting from China's restriction on Lithuanian businesses. So preliminary calculations for 2020 is that we're gonna have probably, because just of that, GDP growth decreased by 0.1 to 0.5%, and in 2023, 0.3 to even 1.3. The lower number represents the impact of ceasing direct trade with China, and the larger number includes the indirect results on investments and etc. So I'm not gonna judge whether it's like a huge impact or like really minor. It's up to you, but I think it was expected to have more devastating results, like from the Chinese perspective. And yeah, despite the Chinese economic revenge, Lithuania is basically did not experience economic collapse. However, the government of Lithuania decided to help, like, at least those businesses who are in direct, they were punished because of these sanctions. So Lithuania created a special fund to help to mitigate the damage caused by the sanctions. And regarding your question about the international support and how do the international community react to that, so it's too early to judge probably the situation. I think we have like US as a strong partner on this issue. We're kind of having a similar perspective regarding diplomacy with China, but EU also proposed some instruments in order to protect its members from the third parties' economic revenge. So in 2021, European Commission published its proposal for EU anti-coercion instrument, which could help in the future to cope with the situations like that. And in my opinion, the major goal of this Lithuanian case is not not to give the China opportunity to show this example as their political power. If international community will leave such a small country as Lithuania alone, China will see that it can achieve its national goals by intimidating other countries. So therefore, in my opinion, so we have to work not as a format 17+1, but we have to deal it as a European Union against China, not to leave the separate countries alone. And in the best case scenario, to have the same position together, EU plus US against China.
Thank you for that. So at this time, we'd like to open it up to the floor. If anybody has any questions out there for our panelists.
Yes, hello, Paweł Berendt, the Boym Institute. Maybe not a question, but I have something to add about why Poland decided to follow the US. So I agree generally with all Aleksandra has said, but what to add? First, that Poland was bitterly disillusioned and disenchanted with Dosenrode initiative. So 10 years ago, at the very beginnings, there were high hopes that have brought not fruition. It was one of the reasons. Second was the very weak business and financial lobby that has interest in China. So under such conditions, following the US, especially when Washington showed interest in the Three Seas initiatives, proved just to be more beneficial. So that's all.
I mean, I totally agree with you that Poland expected that the former will be more beneficial for it, but it turned out that Poland were more open for Chinese investment than China for Polish investment in that country. So, but on the other hand, I would say that that it is from the China perspective. I started from the fact that for China, Poland is not so important, and but looking back to 90s, we can also realize that Chinese investments steadily are growing. So it doesn't mean that they are not so important. I mean, there is dynamic, but not so very strong. Yeah.
Two questions back here.
Hello again. If you read Chinese narratives, one of the standard narratives is, if you trade with us, everything will go incredibly well for you. If you do not, we will trash your economy, simplified. So if we look at what's actually happened, for example, with Australia, yes, they divested a lot following the sanctions, but much of the loss came back. If we look just what happened this week when H&M, which had clothing giant H&M, go Sweden, when they had to close down most of their stores and their online presence in China following their criticism, or they refused to use cotton from Xinjiang. And now they're back on the Chinese e-commerce sites. So I have two questions. One is, to what extent would you say that Chinese sanctions are bluster? And and in what cases do they actually really go through with their sanctions? Are there cases where you can say this will, in all likelihood, lead to real consequences? And secondly, how can we convince, especially captains of business who still think it's 1999, that sanctions do not have the dreadful consequences China outlines? Thank you.
A very short general comment. If you look back in the history of international politics, trade sanctions are basically not very efficient. First time where you see efficient sanctions is actually now towards Ukraine. And even here you hear the director of the Deutsche Bank, who said they were not really, they were hurting us more than Russia. I would say luckily there has just been a study published by a group of economists at Yale University, which is actually telling that they are crippling US economy. But if that is the case, then it's, I was about to say first time in history. That's not so, but I mean, it's, trade sanctions are rarely efficient.
Crippling the Russian economy.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah. Oh, well.
Okay, good. Another question over there?
No, I wanted to say I agree. Trade sanctions are inefficient. That's also what I mentioned before. Unless, of course, you are in a situation where you are hopelessly dependent. I mean, that is the issue. And if you look at the Chinese strategy, also put on paper in 2018, the Chinese strategy is first and foremost to make sure that its own supply and production chains are well kept. And then secondly, it's on paper, to make others as dependent of us as we can reach. So generally, trade sanctions are not a very efficient way to have an economic war, so to speak. But if you are very dependent, then it hurts. And of course, it hurts more for smaller economies than it hurts for larger economies, and more for poor countries than for rich countries.
Various members of the panel have highlighted, rightly so, the opacity of Chinese business dealings, be it lending or following transactions and the details, the transparency levels that are lacking in these closure of contracts. But it takes two to actually close a contract. And my question is, why do governments, why do individual companies that you represent from the countries actually continue to accept that level of lack of transparency? Isn't it possible to actually demand? We've talked about the foreign investment screening and its deficits. But shouldn't it be part of a contractual renegotiation, in light of what we know today, that companies can also say no to a Chinese loan offer? Or that companies say, in order to close and sign a contract, we demand full transparency of its details?
Comment on that?
I can say, taking into account Polish experience and even what was mentioned in the first panel about source of financial for education. I mean, in my perspective, those companies or even educations, it also maybe applied to the universities in the case when the governmental funds are difficult to get. In that situation, it is easier to get financial source from, for example, other sources like China. So, in my opinion, it depends on the possibility of financial from other sources. So, in that sense, and in countries in Central Europe, which are to some extent, we can call them as developing countries, where the institutions, universities, companies have got some problems, difficulties with possessing financial for development. They, to some extent, they can also think about different, even such not transparent source of funds.
Two short comments to that. First of all, business are put in the world to make profit, and they must do that, otherwise they vanish. So you have to make sure that there are the same rules for all businesses, and that implies governments. And governments will very much like that their country's competition is just as good as their neighbor countries. So you have to raise it to EU level, where the EU should try to find common ground there. And as you know, it's always hard. And now that we have Greece, Bulgaria, and Hungary, which are slightly more pro-China than the rest of the EU, then it can be very hard.
Okay, I think we're almost out of time, but we had one more question over there.
Yes, it's still me. But I wanted to attract attention to one phenomena that Aleksandra didn't mention, and I almost forgot about it because it was not really discussed in Poland. Do you know that Poland issued panda bonds? So we kind of took a big loan from China. It was from ICBC, like the bonds were somehow managed by ICBC. Also JP Morgan AG, so I think that's the Frankfurt branch, and it happened actually in autumn 2021, and it was not, you know, like this really discussed from the security point of view. Some articles are just telling that Poland want to be like play naughty towards Biden and EU. And actually, Poland did that for the second time. Like the first one was, I guess, in 2016. And it is like really, you know, I'm myself very curious why they are doing that. But so on the one hand, you have, you know, this narration that Poland follows US and we follow in terms of 5G, Huawei, and so on. But at the same time, like some other like ministries are doing like counterintuitive movements. I heard it's actually like also like the case of like Lithuania or Latvia, where politically, as far as I know, like Latvia is very cautious about the risks connected to China, but there's a lobby within infrastructure which would like to uphold relations with China. So I think if we look at economy, it's important to, you know, map all like the stakeholders, because like even especially in Poland, we know that ministries have different opinion on China. Also the presidential palace has a different view on China. Often they are more open to like, you know, Chinese points of view. And the other are like, you know, private and public companies, which also kind of build their own like even policy towards China. And the problem is, I would say, that there is no institution that would govern, you know, the network that would really map what's going on quantitative and qualitative level. And last year with Pavel Berend, we were doing leading a research group of students on the Belt and Road Initiative with the Zeppelin University. It's a German university in Friedrichshafen. And we were like cooperating together with students to see what are the Chinese influences in Poland and Germany. And there was a conclusion that came from one of the professors from the Zeppelin University that what China does through the BRI is actually governing the network. Imagine that we were like the first link as like students and researchers in Duisburg. So Duisburg is this new Silk Road city in Germany. Who brought together the Łódź, you know, Łódź is like the center for Silk Road in Poland, brought together Łódź and Duisburg officials to talk to each other after so many years. The problem is that China is governing the network, so they talk with Duisburg, with Łódź, you know, with a variety of cities and voivodeships in Poland and lands. And in the EU, we somehow lack of, you know, this like communication, like really good communication channels to see what's going on. And what we actually see right now is that this very similar mechanisms are happening all across Europe. So I think that looking at these problems like in a comparative way is very fruitful. And one last thing towards 16+1, because I participated in most of the 16+1 summits and think tank summits, so I kind of know the vibe pretty well. What I found was the biggest problem is that the West, like in Germany, in France, there was this narrative that 16+1 is a Trojan horse of Europe. But actually they were re-enchanting in this way 16+1, because we as members of 16+1, we felt disenchanted that nothing was going on. You know, so it was like we were disenchanting the initiative and the West was somehow re-enchanting it, that it's somehow powerful, you know, that can diverge Europe. Well, that could have happened, but yeah, it didn't. But that was a very interesting mechanism of narration. And in the end, I just wanted to mention Huawei because you probably know that Poland caught the person who was meant to have some spy activities in Poland. And I knew this person actually by chance from a couple of conferences, because this person was like the speaker for Huawei in Poland. So if you were in the China milieu, you knew this person. And I believe that when the US started this security campaign, it really hit 10 out of 10 because it really kind of raised awareness of Central Eastern Europe and of EU about the risks connected to Huawei. Because you can believe me or not, but Huawei is already in Ministry of Finance in Poland, in a variety of institutions where they gather a lot of private information about citizens. So Huawei already has that information. And the Huawei lobby was very tough on us, and I believe that if US wasn't so strong, it could be that Poland would have Huawei 5G.
Thank you for that. Does anybody have any comments about that? No? So I think we've reached the end of our panel, but I'd like to give each of the panelists about a minute to make any final comments.
That's pretty hard, but I just see that the awareness in Denmark concerning China and Chinese economy, foreign investments, direct investments, so forth, has risen. And as I said, we have chosen side if we must, and that is US and EU.
It's quite difficult to say to sum up this discussion because I feel that it is only the beginning. But personally, I agree with my colleague from Lithuania that the countries from the region should be united toward China. But personally, I'm afraid that it would be very difficult because of the fact that there are so many dimensions of cooperation with China, many attitudes toward China, and many perspectives which influence the behavior of the countries.
Yeah, my final remark would be that we talked about alignment. Your questions were also very much about alignment between the positions of European countries and the US. That sort of assumes that we have a very clear idea about what the US position is when it comes to China. And to be honest, that has not always been clear for me over the past decades. I think there is currently alignment, just like Søren said, when it comes to the securitization issue, thinking about China and its presence in our countries as something that imposes security risks. On the other hand, you also have to understand that there have been signals from the US that especially have used trade as an instrument of protectionism. And that was, of course, the signal that we didn't like and that we didn't want to align to.
To conclude, I would just want to say that initiatives like 17+1, which is like now 14+1, reminds me just old saying, which is known for thousands of years, divide and conquer. So I just suggest just stick together and resist. So let's act as a single entity.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank our panelists for coming up here today. Please, everybody, give them a round of applause. Thank you.